Today we're going to talk about chess mating patterns, and we're going to take a look at some actual games that I played. Here is the king for white. You can notice it has up to 8 moves. Now conversely, when we flip it and look at black's position, you'll notice that black only has 3 moves because it's in the corner. In this example right here, we put a bunch of pieces around both kings. If you'll notice, white's king right here only has really 1 move. Now it has some pieces defending, but it's not as strong as it looks here, where, there's a trap. If you move the bishop in front, this pawn right here is pinned. So the only move really for white is to move the pawn forward by 1. And now if you look at black's position conversely, you'll notice black has 2 moves for its king. Right there. So the goal for black here is to take away all white's flight squares and put white in check. Now we stick some pieces around white's king, and if you'll notice, white's king can't move anywhere. Okay, white can move the rook wherever it wants, but it can't move its king. So let's say white moves its rook over here. All black needs to do is check white, and the game is over, provided that black covers all the flight squares. So where's the obvious move right here? Moving the knight to e6, checkmate. Before we get into more complicated ones, we're going to start with a basic mating pattern here, and that involves rook and king. We're playing as black on the Dr. Chess mobile phone app. If you'll notice, we got a few options here. We have a rook on c1. If you'll notice also that white's king can't move forward, so what we do is we move the rook to b1, check. Now white's king only has 3 options. White goes back. Now notice we have the rook placed on b1. We don't want to move that. What we want to do is we want to get, we would want to move that if the king was right next to it to take it, but white's king is not. What we want to do is we want to move our king close to white's king, and then we're going to get a mate here. So we move the king there. We get lucky. If white had gone for the corner, we would have followed for the corner, but white goes right there. So now all we need to do is take the rook and move it to a1 for checkmate. Okay, now let's take a look at some actual mating patterns from games I played on the Dr. Chess mobile phone app. And this one right here, we're playing as black. The idea is to checkmate white's king, obviously. We have a bishop right here on f8. The idea is to move it to c5, put the king in check. So white's king goes back here. Now, there's this pawn we're looking at on f3. We're going to take that with the queen because it's unprotected. And now we're threatening the e2 square. So what does white do? White moves the knight out of the way. The knight's protected. But more importantly, it's protecting the e2 square. Okay, so the original idea was we take right here. But, unfortunately, white can defend that with a knight. So that doesn't work. So how do we solve this here? Well, if you also notice, we have this bishop right here that we moved. It's covering these 2 squares. We have a bishop right here that's covering these 2 squares. The answer to the question is queen takes the rook on h1. And that's the game right there. In this game right here, black's king has a ton of flight squares. It also has a decent sized wall of defense. Now if you'll notice, we've got all our pieces concentrated here, but black basically has more pieces than we do. So we're down material. We got to figure out a way to win the game. One of the things you may notice when looking at the position is black has a pawn on g6. And this is going to be very important. If you'll notice more closely, that pawn is pinned to the king. So black decides to go with the idea of moving its bishop to threaten our e2 4 pawn right there. And then eventually playing the D6 pawn to D5, and then overloading that pawn and then threatening our queen to try to remove the queen from attacking. Now, if you remember, we have a rook that's penning this piece right here. What that means is that G6 pawn cannot capture should we decide to play this pawn right here, which is what we do. Okay, black decides to go with the idea that I was telling you about earlier, threatening this pawn right here. We don't worry about that. What we do is we put black's king in check right there. Black moves out of the way. We follow with queen takes. This is very important because if black does nothing, even though black has 2 flight squares, there's a discovered check. So there's a lot of powerful combinations here. Black decides to move its king out of the way. We check him again. Now, if you'll notice, black only has 2 flight squares. Black elects to go for D6. Okay, remember we had this pawn right here? Well, it's not going to be used. We're not getting any value out of it. So, and we also need to open up a file for this rook eventually. So we're going to play this pawn right here forward, check, to which black decides to take. Better yet. Now, I originally wanted to play the rook, but after thinking it over for a while, I also want to eliminate black's king's flight squares. So I don't like black's king being able to go to, let's say, C5. So what I decided to do is play this pawn right here forward, check. Now, of course, black's king has only 2 flight squares. It's probably going to move into the defensive position inside its pawns, which it does, to which we can play rook to E1, setting up for a potential mate here. Black decides to push its pawn forward with the idea of removing this pawn right here. But remember, queen's covering this flight square here. And let's go back to black before it's decided here. Black only had 1 flight square, okay? It only has 1 flight square right here. Pushing the pawn forward, it still only has 1 flight square, okay? So that means we've got a queen here blocking the black flight squares right there. So we're not going to do that. That's not a good move. We can't go here because black can block that way. So the only move for white here to end the game is rook to E6, checkmate. In this game right here, one of the things you may notice is that white's king only has a couple of flight squares. However, it has a number of defenders in multiple areas, and we need to figure out a way to remove those. So our first order of business after white moves is to take the bishop and put the king in check. Now, of course, we're going to lose that bishop to the knight right there. But our goal is to clear out the position because we have a material advantage here. So our next option is to take the pawn. We want to remove the king from its flight squares. So next option is to take the pawn right here and check, basically sacrifice the pawn. And white decides not to take it, which is fine, because then we go with option B. Now we have an even stronger position. We're going to take this pawn right here and push it forward. Okay. White decides to push with the rooks. We put them in check here. And now there's only a number of moves. We're going to try to solidify the amount of checks we can get with our queen. By doing that, we're going to take this pawn right here and push it up. That'll allow our queen to put him in check. White's playing for material. That's fine. We're playing to win the game here, so we put him in check. White only has a couple moves. White decides to go this way. So what we need here is another piece. We could keep going checking back and forth. Let's say we go to the square right here, check. That would be an option, but white would still have a number of so let's say we go here. White still has 2 flight squares. White can get around, and it's kind of a perpetual, not a totally perpetual check. So we want to win the game. We decide to instead take the rook, move it to here, and team up with the queen. To which white decides to double up there. That's fine. We put them in check right here. And if you'll notice, they don't have a lot of options. The only good option, I think, is to that square right there. Instead, white decides to play king behind the king to f1, to which we just bring the queen in. I think you can figure out which move is checkmate here. And that's the game. This mating pattern is a little bit of a tough one. We're playing as white. We're trying to get the win here. It's black to move. Black decides that it can take its bishop and basically puts a lot of pressure on our queen. If we move our queen, let's say to here, they take. So that's a bad outcome there. So what do we do? We can't really. I mean, we could check right here, but then they capture. And our queen's still in trouble. So, what's the best move here? If you said queen to d5, that is correct. Okay. Now, black has to block. Black blocks right there. Now remember, this bishop is protected by the queen. So queen takes bishop, not a good idea. What could we do here? Like, what moves could we do here? That's a good, that's the big question here. After going into the time bank and thinking over for a while, I decided to change things up a bit. And what I wanted to do is see if I could get this rook on a8. Or I ended up getting the rook on a8. What I did is I played this rook right here to g7 check. Lost the rook right there. Okay, next move was to get the queen out of the way and get it to g2 right there. Okay? Now, black has to bring another defender. One of the options they could do is maybe, play queen to any one of these light squares. They could play the queen to here. They could play the queen to here. Okay, but fortunately for me, black decides to play rook to f7. That brings an extra defender, so they get 2 defenders now. Unfortunately, for black, that opens up the a8 rook right there. So, we didn't take it yet. We want to remove the defender here. Okay? So I decided to play bishop right here to remove that defender from there. So they moved. Okay, so next move right here, queen takes check. Okay, but the good news now is because we have this bishop in place on h5, black can't block with the rook. So black moves the, they have a number of options. Well, basically one option to move the king or to move the rook. Well, the rook doesn't work anymore. Black moves his king right there. And the next play, of course, is bishop to g6, checkmate. In this game right here, we are playing as white. If you'll notice, we don't have a strong position. But we do have one way to get black's king in check, and that involves the bishop on d2. We're going to sacrifice it. Black takes. We take with the queen. Okay, now if you notice, black's king does not have any flight squares. So black decides to exchange queens. We want to win the game. We don't want to do that because we're down material, so we have to find a mating pattern here. Best move for our queen. is simply to h5 right there. Black smartly notices that its king only has one flight square. Let's make it 2. So black moves the rook right there. Okay. For us, the next move is going to be getting this rook into position. Now, unfortunately, we cannot just go to g1 because black has a bishop already placed. So what do? We push a pawn. That gives us, an extra flight square because we've only got one flight square right now. Pushing the pawn gives us 2 flight squares for our king. Black decides to move its rook forward, trying to give its king more flight squares and get our queen out of there. What do we do next? We play our rook to e2 right there with the idea of going to g2 and putting the king in check. Again, black wants to exchange queens, and black has a rook defending the h6 square, so it moves right there. We don't want to exchange queens right here. Okay? So what do? We take our rook and we play to g2 check. Black doesn't have a ton of options. Black decides to play king to h7 because it's protected by the queen. Okay? But now, if you'll notice of the queen's options, f7 check looks pretty good. Okay, so we're partway there. Now we have to get the other rook involved to get the mating pattern. All right, black plays his king to the only spot it can go. Now, unfortunately, the g8 square has 2 defenders. We've only got 2 attackers. We need to get a 3rd attacker involved. What do? We play king to c2, looking to, number 1, activate the a1 rook, and number 2, give our king some flight squares. Black decides to double up rooks right here, taking away some of our queen's ability. Okay, our next move is we just want more flight squares for the king, so we play pawn forward right here with the idea of putting pressure on black's bishop. We want to see what they do. Black decides to bring their bishop out right there, combining with the queen, so it's actually going to make it harder for us. That's okay. We still have this a1 rook we can activate. Now remember, we can't go to g1. So you have to go to f1 here. Okay. We get really, really lucky here. Black decides to move its bishop to f4. Okay. That's going to allow us to double up our rooks here. So we move the rook to g1. And there's not a lot black can do in this spot because that key g8 square now has 3 attackers to black's 2 defenders. Black decides to try to remove the queen right there by playing the rook to double up on the queen, but it's too late at this point. Now we can move the rook in for a check. Black takes, and then we just capture with the queen right there, and the game is over. This mating pattern right here was against an opponent rated 2132. We have a knight that's threatening the f7 square, and we want to eyeball our queen with that, so what we do is we move our queen right here, threatening f7. Black moves the bishop. Okay, knight's in trouble. We're going to move it into the corner. The one problem with that is now we can't get any pieces back here. If you'll notice, black's king only has 1 flight square at the moment, but it's got a lot of pieces defending it. And we can't just capture the bishop because the queen could take there. So the next idea, after black moves his bishop back, is to take our bishop on c1 and move it into position, threatening the e7 square. We get very lucky black moves his queen out of the way. This queen would have been in trouble, but we get very lucky in that, if you'll notice, for the queen, the A8 rook is open right there. So we go ahead and take that check, to which black blocks with the bishop. We're now going to put our queen back into place. Again, we want to threaten, if you notice, we have a bishop right here threatening the E7 square. So we're going to get our queen in place to threaten that. Okay, to which black plays the bishop to try to remove one of the threats there. Now, if you'll notice, black also had the queen protecting that E7 pawn. So we get to move our queen here. And now, here's where the good idea comes. After black plays bishop threatening the rook. Right there, ready to take the rook. So there's mate in 2. What do you do here? Well, first off, we're going to play the knight. Check. Now, black could take with the bishop. Black elects not to, because we're going to get a rook into the back row. That was the idea. One of the backup ideas here. We get lucky on this in that black's bishop does not take. Black decides to move its king. Okay? To which we play bishop to h6, checkmate, as all of black's flight squares are blocked there. This mate took a while, but the idea is worth showing. We're playing as white, and we basically boxed off their king, and we need to try to win some material here and set up a check here. So the idea is to basically push the E pawn forward, but we can't push it forward right now because it's kind of blocked in. And then that would open up the bishop on black's C7 queen. So a plan here is to take the knight and move it to threaten that bishop on E6. Okay. They move the bishop out of the way. Perfect opportunity. We push the pawn forward. And it does a number of things. Well, first off, it forces them to move the queen. Right there. But more importantly, we're going to have a check coming up here. So we take the pawn and move it right there, check. Now, of course, black captures right there. So we put him in check, black recaptured. So where's the big idea here? How does this really work out here? Well, if you'll notice, we have a queen. But we can't put the king in check because we have a bishop that's in front of it. But the good news is we have a discovered check. And when you have a discovered check, it typically means you get a free move, unless they can recheck you, which they can't do here. So we're going to play bishop to C7, check. And that allows us to win the queen right there as a block. Okay. So that's the first part in this task right here. We lose that piece. And then the idea here was to just play the knight to D7. As it's protected by the rook, we can deal with that exchange there. And then it kind of plays out. It's going to be an interesting mating pattern at the end here. But we won the queen. That's the big part. We're up material. It doesn't mean we can win the game for sure, though. So there's some movement of pieces. What I'm looking to do is get the bishop to take that C6 pawn there. Okay, so the good news for black is they have a rook that could go to the back row mate, so we got to watch out. We decided to push the H pawn forward there. They bring the other rook. Okay, so we have a little bit complicated of position here, but we're going to take our rook and bring it to D1 as it's protected by the queen. Let's see if we can see here. The queen's protecting the D1 square. So, okay, we got that in position here now. Next move, for black, black decides to move its king back. Okay, so here's where it gets complicated. I decide to just take the pawn with the rook right there. The idea somewhere in the back of my head is bishop to this square right here, but it's not completely workable because they can capture with the knight, or they could capture with the rook and then take with the knight, however they want to play it. So I decided to take, instead of doing that move there, I decided to take the pawn right there. Okay. Now it gets even more interesting. Black decides to push with the pawn. Okay. We capture with the pawn there. And now black decides its king's no longer in check because it removed the pin on the knight that we had earlier. So its knight is no longer pinned. If the knight was pinned to the king, the knight loses all these moves. So you got to watch out for pins. And conversely, if you're attacking, you want to get as many pins as possible so you can limit your opponent's opportunities. So they decide to take right there, taking the pawn. Okay. So I've got a little bit of dilemma here. Decide now that since the knight is gone, the knight was defending, if you remember, the knight was defending the d5 square back there. Now that it's here, it's no longer defending that. So I'm going to play bishop right there to d5 check. And I believe black took the option. Black took the option of moving its king to one of the two flight squares there. Okay. And then my queen is in trouble now. If you'll notice, the rook is... Black's rook is threatening the queen, so we got to move it out of the way. We move it right there. It was in trouble before that. We delayed it with a check. So, okay. Queen is safe, but, you know, we've got like a bishop eyeballing. There's a rook, another rook, and, of course, a knight. So there's not really a lot of squares the queen can go to. But we're waiting for Black's move. Black plays a really good move here. And what they play is knight takes. Now, if you'll notice that square right there, that F2 square, that's protected by the rook. Remember this rook right here? That's protecting it. So I can't recapture with the king. So I've just got forked. I got my rook here, and I got my queen here. I've just got forked. So I got to figure out a way to win. And the move is going to involve moving the queen. If you notice, the queen has a number of different options. If you'd like to hit pause and decide where you want to go, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. What I decided to do is go queen to h4. Okay, black decides to capture right there. So we have one rook left, but we have really good position on our pieces, and black's pieces are not so good. So next move right here should be obvious. Queen takes, check. Now remember, we have a bishop well positioned on d5. If you look before, we have a bishop well positioned right there. So once the queen takes, there's no flight squares. It's black's own bishop right here is blocking anything you can do. So black plays the bishop, and then we just take right there for checkmate.
And of course, that is going to wrap us up for mating patterns. Now, of course, if you are looking for more chess, there are a lot of different videos on this channel. I've pretty much separated those into 3 different playlists. One of them is chess for beginners. There's a bunch of tips and strategies and tactics and stuff. We just cover how it works. I actually hadn't played for a while, and I had to watch quite a few of them to get back into it, and they worked really well for me. Another one that worked really good for me is the chess challenges for pure chess. That's for the PS4. You don't have to have the PS4 or the game to watch the videos, as you can just see the problems as they are, and then you try to solve themselves, and then look at the actual explanation for that. There's 99 problems in there, so there's quite a few problems in there. And then finally, there is chess versus the AI at the hardest level. If there was an engine that I beat, can't beat every engine, but some of these engines, they may be tough, but they're beatable. We've got the game on there. We explain how to, and some of the games are just I play and then just record as I'm thinking. Other ones, I beat it and then I went through the moves. So there's a lot of cool options there as well. And of course, that'll wrap this up. I'm signing out. Thanks for watching and good luck.